Today's episode is brought to you by We Break You Buy. Interested in sports cards and memorabilia? Check out We Break You Buy on TikTok. We Break You Buy is a small operation run by three brothers, offering spots for a chance at winning some incredible sports cards and memorabilia. That's We Break You Buy. Check it out today on TikTok. Patrick Darms.
And I'm your co-host, Anton Paras.
Paul Kind, return guest. Welcome back to the podcast.
Welcome back, Paul.
Thank you very much. Great to be back. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to relive my past.
Of course, it's our pleasure. And, of course, happy Christmas to you and your family and a happy New Year as well. I hope it was a wonderful time for you.
Yeah, now it's all a case of trying to burn that Christmas dinner and New Year's booze.
Yeah, we're hitting the sauce hard here at the household, but that's how the holiday season usually goes.
Yeah, same here, and it's gonna be a sprint to the New Year's, right? You got to crack open another barrel of whatever you like to enjoy and ring in. Yeah, a barrel, right? Doesn't everyone have a barrel to enjoy their holidays with?
Sure.
We'll keep the listeners guessing.
Well, Paul, it's great to have you back. The last episode that we had you on for was somehow a much older movie than the one that we're discussing today, Cleopatra. That was the 50th anniversary, or 60th anniversary, I should say, that you helped us celebrate. That was really fun to talk about. Although I think we can all admit, not that necessarily that fun to watch, but this one was.
Without doubt, one of my favorite disaster movies of all time.
Yeah, it's a beloved disaster movie. We are, of course, here today to discuss The Poseidon Adventure, the 1972 disaster film, not the 2006 remake, and I honestly didn't even know this until doing the research for this episode. There was a made-for-TV remake that came out in 2005, which never heard of it. But we're not talking about that one either. We're talking about the real deal here.
Pat, how can we not talk about the 2005 version that featured a very famous Baldwin with first initial A? It wasn't Alec Baldwin, it was Adam Baldwin. And I'm sure a lot of people didn't even know there was an Adam Baldwin.
I know who Adam Baldwin is, but yeah, is he officially a Baldwin, or is he just someone with the name?
He's just someone with the name Baldwin. He's not a Baldwin.
Oh, he's not related to Alec Baldwin at all?
No, he's not.
Oh.
No.
Huh, I always thought he was.
Fun stuff, right?
Something you learn every day. Well, Paul, before we get into the discussion of this week's film, is there anything you'd like to plug or promote?
Yeah, sure. I've kind of given this some thought, and I'd like to big shout out to the National Portrait Gallery, which is in London. It's a place where I currently work. It's a fantastic gallery. Got everything from Tudors, Stuarts, all the way up to modern day celebrities like Ed Sheeran, and highly recommend it if you're in town at any point.
Well, absolutely check that out the next time I'm in London. I've always wanted to go.
Same.
But last time I was there, I did not have the time.
Well, I look forward to being able to take you around on a personal tour.
That would be outstanding. I will absolutely take you up on that offer.
Yeah, I'd love a locals tour. Last time I was there, I spent too much of my time trying to find platform 9 3/4, and when I found it, it wasn't even working. So that was tough.
Yeah, it's surprisingly underwhelming. King's Cross is impressive, but the Harry Potter thing is like, magic's not real, so
Essentially, it's like a brick wall with half a trolley in it, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, pretty much. It's there's a little gift shop there too, which I didn't go into. But yeah, I mean, Anton, I was thinking, eventually I think we need to do a trip to our beloved Pinewood Studios, because it would be a write-off.
Yes, we do need to go to Pinewood, friend of the show, Pinewood Studios. We definitely give them a lot of
Pinewood Studios.
Yeah.
Paul, have you ever been there? Do they do publicity stuff there?
I've never been myself, but I know where it is because it's right next to a really nice park where we used to take our dog for a walk. So you could kind of see over the fence to lots of green screens and big buildings. But no, I've never actually been in. They do a lot of TV shows there, so you can get tickets for comedy shows, panel shows, those kind of things. So they don't just do film stuff.
No, it makes sense. Well, the film that we are discussing today was unfortunately not filmed at Pinewood Studios, but that's okay because it's going to be fun to discuss anyway. The Poseidon Adventure. The tagline of this film is Hell Upside Down. En route from New York City to Greece on New Year's Eve, the majestic passenger ship SS Poseidon is hit by a rogue wave. With the captain dead, the surviving passengers, including the passionate Reverend Scott, band together in the ship's ballroom. The group struggles to avert fires, flooding, structural instability, and mechanical malfunctions as they make their way through a maze of ladders and tunnels in their desperate attempt to escape a watery grave. The Poseidon Adventure was released on December 12th, 1972 by 20th Century Fox, directed by Ronald Neame, screenplay by Sterling Siliphant and Wendell Mays, based on the novel of the same name by Paul Gallico, starring Gene Hackman, Ernest Borgnine, Red Buttons, Carol Lindley, Roddy McDowall, Stella Stevens, Shelley Winters, Jack Albertson, Jack O'Connell, and Leslie Nielsen. Budget $4.7 million. That is only $35 million adjusted for inflation. Box office, $125 million. Get this, gentlemen. $920 million adjusted for inflation. That is an unbelievable return on their money.
It's a home run.
And it's a grand slam right there. Paul, why did you want to discuss the Poseidon Adventure?
I think for a couple of reasons. One is it's such a childhood favorite of mine. It really launched the disaster movie genre for me. And the other reason is Irwin Allen is part of my childhood, from everything from Time Tunnel, Lost in Space, all those great TV shows. So as far as I'm concerned, anything with his name on it could not go wrong. You know, it was a must-see film. And I just don't remember it being bad. I just remember just really, really enjoying it. So it was a good opportunity to sort of reflect whether those memories are still true or actually had it worn really, really badly. So yeah, that's why I really wanted to be part of it.
Well, I think it was an excellent choice on your part. And basically, the reason why we thought it was a great film to cover is although it was enormously successful and although it received and won multiple awards, there's been a backlash against these disaster films that has really permeated over the years. Now, disaster films, of course, they were at their heyday in the 1970s. They fell out of favor during the 1980s. They experienced a pretty significant resurgence in the 90s and early 2000s, which we actually discussed, Anton, when we covered Airport last season, which was really the first contemporary disaster movie of its era. That came out in 1970. But there is a lot of criticism directed towards this film, mainly that it's corny. And like I just said, a lot of these disaster films, they obviously were enormously successful. At least some of them were in their own right. This one was in particular. But additionally, there is just a huge section of audiences that don't take them seriously as films for whatever reason. And frankly, another reason we wanted to cover it is just this: they're a lot of fun to watch and talk about, even if the quality may vary on some of them. But the Poseidon Adventure is absolutely one of the most famous disaster films of all time. I think it is safe to say this is a classic because it was one of the most financially successful films of the 70s. It was an absolute mega hit. Gene Hackman was enormously popular at the time. He was fresh off of his Oscar-winning performance in The French Connection. He was a big draw, but it had all these other stars in the film: Shelley Winters, Jack Albertson, Ernest Borgnine, Red Buttons, all of whom were Oscar winners as well. And this was really a trend that Airport had started, which was not an Irwin Allen production, but nonetheless was very influential on this film. Airport was significant because it took the disaster genre, which was previously basically just B movies, and it elevated it to blockbuster status by giving it high production values and, most importantly, all-star casts. This film has a brilliant all-star cast. The plot, maybe it's thin, maybe it's not. Disaster strikes, a bunch of famous actors have to survive various dangers on screen with a little melodrama thrown in for good measure. That's about it. Unlike Airport, Anton, this film has a pretty solid legacy. Like I said, it's definitely a classic. They've remade it twice, most famously in 2006 with Poseidon, but the original is absolutely a classic. I would say even younger viewers who hadn't seen it are familiar with at least the concept. If you were to explain this to someone like, oh, I've never seen the Poseidon Adventure, what is it? You're like, well, it's where the ship flips over from the waves. They're like, oh, yeah, I know that movie. Of course they do. That's how famous it is. And Paul, like you, although you're older than me, I watched this a ton as a kid. It was just on American TV a lot, and my grandparents owned it on VHS. So for whatever reason, it was just a film that I saw a bunch as a kid. It had quite an impact on me. You know, this and Superman were really how I became a Gene Hackman fan originally. And then years later, Anton, I realized the Pokemon anime's episode arc on the SS Anne was a parody of this movie for all you Pokemon fans out there. But that's my history with the Poseidon Adventure. Anton, do you have any?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, watching the film as a kid, watched it a couple times, and rewatching, for the episode, it is such a treat just to see a lot of the care that was put into the film, and then also just the cast. I think when I think about when we watched Airport versus this film, there were definitely a lot of one, I'm a big fan of the cast of the Poseidon Adventure. There are a lot of names here that, like you, big fan of Hackman, Jack Albertson, who of course can't forget Grandpa Joe from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Ernest Borgnine. It's so many. It's great to see so many wonderful actors in the film that I love seeing across some of my favorite movies. And so being able to revisit that for the podcast, one, great to see and really analyze and dig deep, because this film has a lot of layers. It's definitely, I think, well worth the amount of money that it made in the box office. But we'll really dig into that, won't we?
For sure. Just to reiterate on the box office numbers again, because I was really blown away doing the research for this. I mean, they basically made it for $35 million and it made almost $1 billion. That is a return on investment that you just do not see with almost any film, regardless of the era that it came out in. There's really no equivalent of that. Now, and you look at something like, for example, the second Avatar film that we covered a few weeks ago, Anton, which made, $2.3 billion, third or fourth highest grossing film of all time. You're like, wow, that's amazing. That's a ton of money. It's like, yeah, but it cost them $500 million to make it. So when you look at the percentage points and adjusting it for inflation, not even nearly as successful as this was.
And it's interesting, too, when you look at the box office history, they ended up reissuing it again 2 years later, and it still came back to number one at the box office. So if the film's that good in the box office, it's definitely worth taking another look at years later.
Yeah, Paul, I think you can probably address this. They don't really seem to do this anymore, but I think this was much more common back in that era where they would re-release films occasionally every few years if it was successful enough. It seems to be a trend that you don't really see that anymore at all. Obviously, why would you? Because what happens, now with the streaming revolution. But that seemed to be much more common then.
Yeah, there was. What they used to try and do as well is they would have like a double bill. When it was first released, they'd show it on its own. But then, a couple of years later, they may show it with another film. So I remember seeing 2 James Bond films together. I remember seeing Where Eagles Dare, I think, was it with a James Bond film or another war film? So there was sort of different ways
That's
to
cool.
draw you in. But obviously those days you didn't have the 3 hour 3.5 hour run times that you tend to find in movies today. So I would have, that's probably one of the reasons. To sort of earlier point about the amount of money it costs. The thing is, it was virtually all practical, wasn't it? And there was the day it wasn't a CGI film. And I think today they'd say, okay, we'll just make everyone will just be in front of a green screen. And you say this would then become a $300 million budget, whereas they just went to an old sort of, ship and things like that. They kept things very minimal.
Yeah, I don't know how much the 2006 remake directed by Wolfgang Peterson cost, but I would imagine it was $150, $200 million, and that was in 2006. But I was still surprised by how cheaply they made this film just because of all the big names involved. You would think Hackman, coming off that Oscar, would get a big salary. Everyone else, again, Shelley Winters, who may not be a name that younger viewers are familiar with these days, but she was a double Oscar winner. She wouldn't have been cheap. a lot of the actors that they hired wouldn't have been cheap, and that's why the budget still really impresses me. As far as the production history of this goes, Paul, you mentioned Irwin Allen and how influential he was on the disaster genre as well as others. I do want to introduce the listeners to the name Irwin Allen. If you are not familiar with him, he is the producer of this film. By the 1970s, he was a veteran of Hollywood and television. He made his bones in television with a lot of lower budget sci-fi films and shows. With 20th Century Fox scaling back their film projects due to the massive expenditure on Cleopatra, Irwin Allen hit it big by producing the popular TV series Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which aired on ABC. It was essentially an adaptation of a 1961 film of the same name, which Allen himself had directed. Now, if you'll recall from our Airport episode, which you probably don't because that was a while ago, Airport did not technically invent the disaster genre. We touched on this a bit earlier. Disaster movies had been around for years, but only existing as low-budget affairs. What Airport did was elevate them to blockbuster status by adding famous actors and bigger budgets. Back to the show, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. This is what originally planted the seed for what would become the Poseidon Adventure. Allen used many of the same craftsmen on his TV show that he did on his films, including a young composer by the name of John Williams. Pretty cool. Everyone should at least be familiar with that name. And if you're not, just go reevaluate your life. Around the same time, Allen produced the TV series Lost in Space, which, Paul, you mentioned, and that's been adapted a few different times. It was a pretty crappy 1990s movie and a more recent, I think it was a Netflix series a couple years ago. I haven't seen it, but again, Lost in Space, pretty interesting legacy. Paul Gallico published a novel called The Poseidon Adventure in 1969. He had been inspired to write the novel after a vacation aboard a ship in 1937, which was rocked by high waves. Seeing the similarities between the novel and some of the previous projects he had worked on, Irwin Allen quickly snapped up the film rights. Fast forward to the early 1970s. Even with the enormous financial success of Airport, Allen initially struggled to find a studio to back his project. Convinced that the film would be a hit, Allen was determined to get it made, and he raised half of the budget on his own before finally getting 20th Century Fox to agree to fund the other half. One of the screenwriters, Sterling Silliphant, is yet another Oscar winner, having won for the 1967 film In the Heat of the Night, which is a brilliant film, absolute classic. Anton, something to add?
Oh, no, I accidentally pressed unmute. My bad.
Oh, okay. Well, feel free to jump in if you do. Just cut me off. Director Ronald Neame was hired at the request of the head of Fox Studios at the time. Neame was mostly known for directing human dramas. Because the budget was modest, every single shot was carefully planned and budgeted in advance. Every scene was meticulously storyboarded. Some of the scenes were filmed aboard the HMS Queen Mary, permanently berthed in Long Beach, California, which I believe, Anton, it's still there. You can.
Yep,
There's a restaurant there and whatnot.
There's a restaurant. You can definitely walk on and take a tour to this day.
Very cool. I always wanted to check that out, but when I foolishly went to LA for the first time, I was like, Long Beach is not that far away. I can probably rent a car and drive there. And it's like, no, it's like a 90-minute drive.
It's massive. Getting from one part of LA during rush hour traffic could take you 3 hours.
And a fun fact about this film, it's based on something that actually very nearly happened to the ship that played the Poseidon, the Queen Mary. She was hit by a colossal 92-foot rogue wave in World War II while carrying over 11,000 troops to the European theater and heeled over so hard that everything and everyone on the ship crashed over. If it had tipped over by just like 1 or 2 more degrees, she would have capsized, killing everyone aboard. I believe it was officially clocked at hitting 52 degrees. If you've ever been on a boat and you know some geometry like that, that's
terrifying.
Absolutely terrifying. And just a personal note before I forget to mention this specific plot in this film is like one of my all-time worst nightmare scenarios. Like if I was on this ship and this happened to me, I've had nightmares about this. Like this film gave me nightmares as a kid.
Just quick check, have either of you ever been on a cruise?
No,
not like this. No.
Yeah, no, I haven't either, and I think there is a lot of, like, in the back of my mind, apprehension for being on a cruise just because of there have been some pretty high profile disasters around them. So back on the production, for scenes set during the storm, cameras mounted on gyros were used to simulate the rocking of the ship. And the set for the dining room, the focus of the film as the ship capsizes, was designed to match that of the Queen Mary, but was built in sections that could be tilted by a forklift to simulate the ship rolling over, then mounted upside down for the scenes immediately afterward. The set for the banquet hall was designed so that very few objects needed to be moved from the floor to the ceiling, and vice versa. The columns along the walls were identical at the top and bottom, and the wall decorations were all removable. 125 stunt performers were used for the film, and most of the exterior shots of the Poseidon were shot using a large miniature built from the original blueprints of the Queen Mary. And the model is on display at the Los Angeles Maritime Museum. The Irwin Allen rock and roll is when the camera is rocked as the on-screen cast rushes from side to side on the set, simulating a ship being tossed around. And in the film Ocean's 13, Linus Caldwell, played by our good friend of the show, Matt Damon, announces to a catatonic Ruben Tishkoff that Rusty Ryan is doing an, quote, Irwin Allen, which is a reference to the fake earthquake they staged later in the story. A little fun tidbit. Now, the film was shot in sequence, taking advantage of the fact that the principals became dirtier and more tattered and suffered injuries, some real and some artificial, as they progressed. Burt Lancaster turned down the role of Reverend Scott, believing it wasn't right for him, and we have to wonder if his infamous dislike of airport also influenced his decision. George C. Scott was also offered the role before Gene Hackman eventually took it. Now, Shelley Winters gained 35 pounds for the part of Belle Rosen. Personally, the Rosens were a couple of my favorite characters in the film. Even though her character is presented as an elderly, retired woman, Shelley Winters was only 51 when the film was made. Ernest Borgnine was actually 3 years older than Winters, despite the fact that his character treats her like an old woman. So Red Buttons and Carol Lindley, whose characters fall in love in the movie, actually disliked each other intensely during filming. And the famous interior capsizing sequence was done in 2 parts. The first part had the hydraulically controlled set tilted to its maximum 45 degrees. The cameras were then stopped, and the set was redressed so that the floor and the deck became the ceiling, the overhead, and vice versa. The actors were then returned to the set, which was then tilted further to complete the sequence. As the actors performed more and more stunts, director Ronald Neame said that soon they started to get competitive and try not to be outdone by each other. Actor Ernest Borgnine admitted that there was a sense of excitement leading up to the start of the filming of the stunts, but occasionally there were moments during and after where he questioned whether he should actually be doing them. Still, Borgnine and others have stated many times that everything was carefully done and no one got hurt. None of the actors had a good time on set, and it sounds like it was a pretty miserable shoot. Now, Irwin Allen ended up directing a handful of the action scenes, and as a result, attempted to get an official co-director credit for the film, leading to a feud between him and Ronald Neame, who ended up taking him to arbitration with the Directors Guild. L.B. Abbott and A.D. Flowers won a Special Achievement Academy Award for the film's optical and physical effects. It's worth pointing out that the editor, Harold F. Kress, was an Oscar winner himself for How the West Was Won. And John Williams received an Academy Award nomination for scoring this film. So even at this early stage in his career, he was already an Oscar winner, having won previously for Fiddler on the Roof. So John Williams definitely starting early with a success.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep track here, and here's the list of Academy Award winners who participated in this film. Hackman, Borgnine, Shelley Winters, Red Buttons, Jack Albertson, John Williams, screenwriter Sterling Silliphant, Harold Kress, the editor, art director Raphael Breton, special effects supervisors L.B. Abbott and A.D. Flowers. So that's 11. All involved in one film. It might be a record. I didn't actually look this up, but you have to think 11 Oscar winners working on one film is a pretty incredible amount.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, when I think of Hackman, it's like you said, coming off of the French Connection. Now, for a film like this, I think it's definitely one of those decisions where it's an Oscar-winning actor kind of going for a payday, but still having someone like that in the stable of the film, so impressive.
We'll get to him a little bit later. He was not a fan of this film, but it's weirdly one of my favorite Hackman performances. Like when I think of Gene Hackman, this is one of the first films I think of. I don't know that he would appreciate that, but whatever, who cares?
I'm sure he also wouldn't love to hear that one of my favorite performances was him in The Replacements.
I think he might. You never know.
Yeah, you never know. Maybe he's like, you know what? I actually did really enjoy my time on the Poseidon Adventure.
He's never really spoken about it. The song that plays at the end of the film and sort of during the film also, the morning after, it won the Academy Award for Best Original Song, and it was a #1 hit in the United States.
I hate that song.
It's pretty corny. ABC paid $1 million for the television rights to this film. At the time, it was the most money a network ever paid for a film's broadcast rights. And Paul, this one's for you. The sequel, Beyond the Poseidon Adventure. It was also based on a novel by Paul Gallico. It was released in 1979. It was a complete box office bomb. Have you seen it?
I have seen it, but I couldn't tell you anything about it. It's that forgettable, sadly. So
I wonder if we should cover it.
Yeah, I don't think I actually went to the cinema to see it. I'm sure it was probably on a VHS when it came out, something like that. But by that point, I was trying to get into like X-rated films and stuff like that. So Beyond the Poseidon is probably not really on my radar anymore.
That's fair. I don't think you're alone in thinking that. I haven't really found a single positive thing about it.
I can't even remember what the plot was, to be honest.
I don't even know how you'd make a sequel to this film.
Yeah.
But they tried and failed. Producer Irwin Allen proposed a sequel that would have had the survivors testifying in a hearing on the disaster in Austria, the country of the Poseidon's parent company. While on a train to the hearing, a miles-long tunnel mountain would collapse, leaving the survivors of the train trapped inside, struggling to make their way out. The film was planned to be released at Christmas 1974 by 20th Century Fox. Most of the main cast was initially intended to reprise their roles from this film, but it ended up falling through. But this concept was eventually used in the 1996 Sylvester Stallone film called Daylight, which I have seen as a kid, but I, like you, Paul, would be on the Poseidon Adventure. I don't remember much about it. Anton, you got any ammo for us for Daylight?
No, I'm in the dark for that one.
Daylight, classic. Went to see that film.
Really?
With Stallone, right?
Yeah.
The tunnel where the tunnel collapses in New York, and he's got to get.
Did you just call that a classic?
It was a classic of its time. Well, I say, one of many Stallone's like vehicles of hero types.
I don't know if that's one of the better Stallones.
I wouldn't call it better. Maybe not even a classic, but it is part of his. That.
I would rank over the. I'd rank over the top above Daylight, but then fun fact: Daylight did feature Viggo Mortensen. Interesting little tidbit.
I don't know. I don't remember anything about it. Is it worth revisiting? It doesn't sound like it.
Probably not.
You're both shaking your head, so I'm going to say no. You're like, nah.
Maybe if you've got some ironing to do or filling up the dishwasher or whatever, maybe put it on in the background.
Okay. Well, I'm going to pass on that one. It's time to talk about why it wasn't better, The Poseidon Adventure. The number one reason that is often held against this film is that it is cheesy. It is routinely included on lists of the best good, bad movies of all time. There's a lot of content that you can look up that describes this as a, quote, enjoyable bad movie, end quote. I am not sure that I agree with that at all, because we talked about the box office numbers. It received 8 Academy Award nominations. It won 2. It has a 79% score on Rotten Tomatoes, which is pretty good. I just don't see how you can say this is a bad film. This was a success in every measurable.
But I mean, Pat, I got to tell you something. You know what my dad always said? He said an angel is a belief with wings.
That's a good one.
Or, I mean, don't you, while watching the film, didn't you just ask yourself the question, why does God let people die?
God gets brought up a few different times in this film, which I liked. I liked the fact that the main character was a reverend. That is not something that is common certainly not in any modern film. Roger Ebert summed this movie up as, quote, the kind of movie you know is going to be awful, and yet somehow you got to see it, end quote. I certainly agree with him that you want to see this type of film if you see the trailer, but like, I'm playing devil's advocate here. Like, why would you think this would be awful? Why?
I think part of it is when one is into good films, of course, there's a lot of expectation, like, right, quote, air quotes here for listeners, good films. There's a lot of expectations of what a type of film should look like. And typically someone doesn't look at a disaster film as being able to fit the mold of that. So that's where I think a lot of that expectation comes from traditionally.
Yeah, I just wonder if, because it's a disaster movie, that they're never held in high esteem anyway. So people are immediately making conclusions that this is not going to have any depth. It's all about the visuals, the struggle, and everything else, rather than the human aspect, good dialogue, thumping story, whatever. But I feel it transcends that. I think, Gene Hackman does a stirring job as, someone that's going to lead this motley band of people. It's well constructed. People are really interesting. They set it up really nicely. But if you just see the trailer, you might just think, well, it's just a plain old disaster movie, so there's not going to be no depth.
That is fair. I think the one thing that may not work in this film's favor is the title is a little misleading. Like adventure implies like fun, like lighthearted thrills. This is anything but an adventure. Disaster would have been a good way of describing it, but of course they're not going to put that in in the title. But I mean, this is like you could almost make the case this is a horror movie. In a way, it is. In many ways, this is far scarier to me than a lot of horror movies, actual like real horror movies that I end up seeing.
Well, I think part of the way we're looking at it is the similarities, right? Their characters meeting their demise. And Pat, I'm sure we'll talk about this, is in the key difference is you actually feel bad for the people in this film.
Yeah, you do. And this is why I think you could almost like subcategorize this as a horror movie. Is I had forgotten how some of these old school disaster movies, how gruesome some of the deaths are. They are unforgiving with a lot of the characters. Like there's stuff in here. I know it was probably rated G or PG, but there's some stuff in this film. You're like, holy cow.
It was a lot more vivid. It was definitely a bit more over the top than I expected. Like someone had a piano fall on them. There was a scene where you do get a shot of like a woman just getting crushed by like a bunch of debris. It's a lot.
Yeah, like there's not really gore, but
right.
I had just forgotten how many people. Obviously, a lot of the characters in the film die, but I forgot how much of it they actually show.
What I really liked about it was the fact that the majority, it was a star cast, right? And they were willing to sacrifice some of that cast during the story. So you never quite knew who was going to survive and who was going to die. And I think that ratchets up the tension in any film. But if you have a film where you know that basically the heroes are going to get through no matter what, it isn't the same sort of film. And I think that fact that key characters at different points either suddenly just die or that something's not quite right and you're given a little bit of time to see them sort of pass away. I think it's a credit to the film, and I think that kept you on edge all the way through.
Completely agree. I don't know that a modern film would take this many risks with killing off so many main characters like this film does. I don't remember much about the 2006 remake. I think that they followed the same vein where they killed off most of the characters. I only saw it once, and I just don't remember enough about it. But if they were to make this now, which I think we can all agree there's just no way they could or would, at least not for this kind of budget that we're talking about. I just don't know that they would kill off this many characters. But it's a good point you make, Paul, about the tension that this film creates where anyone at any point could buy it.
Yeah, I mean, the Roddy McDowall character, he's coming on the back of Cleopatra and all this sort of stuff. So you think, okay, he's a major part in this.
Yeah, he was deep in ape land at this point.
Yeah. So, that was a surprise. Are we allowed to spoil the plot here?
For a 50-year-old film, I think we can.
All right. So obviously, Shelley Winters, I think that's the one we remember most because of the famous sort of diving in, doing her bit, saving Jean, and then sacrificing herself through ill health. But it was great. It was really good that they were throwing these people and going, right, this is the bit where you die, and then the plot moves on, and it's the courage and the conviction that keeps driving them forward no matter what.
I really like what Irwin Allen had to say about it. He called it the Walter Mitty situation, taking ordinary people, putting them into extraordinary situations, and seeing which ones rise to the occasion. The Walter Mitty thing, it makes a ton of sense. All of the characters are just regular people. Gene Hackman, he's just some random priest. He's nobody special. Borgnine is a retired policeman, but he's not some cliched super cop. He's not portrayed as heroic at all. His wife has to basically like badger him into doing the right thing multiple times. He just wants to survive, and yet ultimately he does end up leading the rest of the survivors out. I will say this about the criticism of this film. There are certainly parts of it that are cheesy. Anton, the song, it's not great. When they're playing it in the in the banquet hall, and the band is one of the most stereotypically 1972 cast of characters I can ever think of in a film. It was comical. It was like they looked so dated with the hair and the garb that they might have been Muppets.
The ruffles everywhere, the frill everywhere.
Look, there are definitely cheesy parts. Some of the dialogue sounds like an old film. There's no doubt about it. There's a real distinct lack of profanity that in a situation like this you would expect quite a bit of profanity, let's face it. But I think the film works because it doesn't really take itself too seriously in any of the scenes. There is some serious dramatic acting, but nobody really goes too far. Ultimately, I think this film knows what it is. Most of the cast are just playing it straight, which I think works in pretty much any film in any situation. Don't overdo it. Don't underdo it. Just play it straight. The cast do that.
The cast does do that, but at the same time, I came out strong with two different quotes where just reading them on paper, I'm like, this is pretty wild stuff. And, delivery wise, I just end up seeing it and saying, well, the film's a little dated and some of these performances are meant to exude this is in a panic, that this is a disaster. But when you really start to look at some of the lines, you can't help but think this film's a little mozzarella, if you know what I mean.
I think it's good popcorn entertainment. You're right about the mozzarella. Look, there is some cheese. There's some campiness in this film, but it is fun. I'm going to reiterate it. The solid performances from the cast are what really propel this along.
Agreed.
And it has got some genuine thrills in it. And we were talking a bit about this just before we started recording. What ultimately makes this film a success in my eyes is you actually care about the characters, which is one of the highest compliments you can give any film, regardless of genre, regardless of era, regardless of who's in it. If you find yourself caring about the characters, the film has done its job.
Oh yeah, it's because how difficult is that, right? For someone to come in without having any connection, actual connection to the characters in the film and be able to feel emotions for them. And I will definitely say I felt that in this film.
And I thought Red Button did a great job of keeping that group together and really certainly caring about the singer, who quite honestly I'd have left behind hours ago. She was so annoying.
Nani?
It's like, oh my God. It was like one thing. I'm not going down the tunnels. I'm not going up the ladders. I can't go here. I can't go there. Yeah, he convinced her.
Did you like my brother's music?
And even the kid, right? To be honest, I thought all American young boys, that's how they were. They were sort of know-it-alls, little brash. But thank God he had all that. Thank God he had all that knowledge, right?
Well, that's the good thing about this character, right? Where he starts off as fairly annoying, and then it's good writing on the part of the screenwriters. He actually has useful information, and Borgnine's character, he tries to downplay it. You're just a kid. Yeah. And then is it Red Buttons who speaks up for him, or is it Gene Hackman? One of the two, maybe both of them. They're like, well, actually, what the kid's saying makes a lot of sense, and he's already been all over the ship with that crewman. Maybe we should actually do the right thing here and listen to him, because he might be the only person who knows what he's talking about. It's good writing.
It is. I mean, compare that, Pat, to a very, there was the young kid who I think was an adult man playing a kid in Airport, right? Calls out something he's seeing. Yeah. He's calling out seeing something. I think there's something off about like the constellations and the placement of the plane, and the pilot's like, "That's right, son." Or just some throwaway line.
Dean Martin, yeah. He's like, "You just sit tight there, and I'm gonna have another scotch and soda, baby."
It's definitely an improvement.
Yeah.
Sorry, one issue I have with the little lad was he decides he needs to go for a pee and goes to the John, but the John's upside down. And it's like, what was he hoping to find? He literally could have gone anywhere, to be honest.
Yeah, dude, the ship's sinking. Just pee on the wall, like whatever.
And to be honest, the last place I'd want to be is in the John after it's turned upside down. Can you imagine?
Yeah, that's gross. And like, not only that, it's like the ship's sinking. Like, maybe not wander off. Like, some of the writing is definitely ropey. Some of the dialogue, it does feel like a film from 1972. But again, the cast is strong enough that you do end up caring about what happens to them. And I don't care what movie it is. It's impossible not to root for Gene Hackman and Ernest Borgnine. I was talking about this film recently with someone I'm very close with, who will remain nameless. And they're like, "Oh, the Poseidon Adventure, that was terrible. It was so cheesy." I'm like, how can you not watch a movie and with Gene Hackman and Ernest Borgnine as the main characters and not root for them? You know, in a future film that we're going to talk about, Anton, the Towering Inferno, which I think, you know, not to spoil anything for that future episode, but like it's a very long movie and it's far more melodramatic than this. But it's like, okay, your main characters are Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, and William Holden. It's like, I can watch that. Like, I don't care what the movie's about. Those three actors are in it. It's watchable. Same thing with Hackman and Borgnine.
And younger listeners may recognize Hackman, but maybe I would assume more may not recognize Ernest Borgnine's name, but a legend in films. And
yeah,
there's also a lot of, I'd say, a variety of films, not just art house films, but he was in Escape from New York. He was in Basketball. So there was, and who else can forget the fact that our very own Ernest Borgnine was the voice of Mermaid Man in SpongeBob SquarePants. So our younger listeners absolutely know that voice.
I believe he died in 2018, maybe a little bit before that, but he was about 95, 96 years old when he died, and he worked up until the very end. He just consistently worked. He was a real talent.
Absolutely.
He started off playing just a lot of mooks. You know, there's an old school term for you, mook. But he got the role of a lifetime with Marty in 1955. He took full advantage of it. He won the Oscar for it. He was in McHale's Navy, but he was like I don't want to undersell him. He was basically a character actor for the rest of his career. He didn't have a lot of starring roles. And I don't want to call him an underrated actor because when you win an Oscar and you work that long, you probably aren't underrated. But to your point, Anton, if audiences are not familiar with him, he was a real talent. He never phoned in a role. Everything I've ever seen him in, he always gives a great performance.
Always commits, and there's a liveliness that Ernest would brings to the screen that you absolutely saw in this film for sure.
Yeah, a real genuine sincerity that he brought to any role that he was in.
He was also in some of my favorite films, which were Flight of the Phoenix, The Dirty Dozen, and
yes,
the Wild Bunch, which doesn't get the credit that it deserves. It's a fantastic film.
All classics. And Anton, you mentioned Escape from New York. He doesn't have a huge role in that, but a very memorable role as the cabbie. If you're under a certain age, you have to be a film buff to really know his name, but he was a real talent. And then, of course, Hackman, I would imagine he is in the pantheon to the point where, regardless of how old you are, you know who Gene Hackman is. Maybe you don't recognize his name, but you certainly know his face. You certainly know some of his work. And like I said, this is one of my favorite Hackman roles, despite what he may feel about this role. He called this a, quote, money job, but a good performance is a good performance. He always delivers. He is one of the all-time greats. And I'm honestly grateful for some of the lesser roles, quote unquote lesser roles that an actor of his caliber will take, such as this one, because anytime he's in a film, and this is a great example of it, he just elevates the material of whatever he's in, right? Think about, he's been in a bunch of bad movies, I'm sure, but you probably have seen a bunch of them. Yeah, one of my favorite actors of all time, absolutely.
I mean, he was in Quest for Peace, so
that's a money job.
Yeah, that's a money job.
Still, Anton, never saw it, never will.
But he was also in Hoosiers, so...
Weirdly enough, he also did Hoosiers as a money job, and that's one of his best performances.
And I like to think he did the birdcage out of passion.
Paul, have you seen Hoosiers?
I haven't, no. Should I be?
That's a really, really good basketball movie from the 80s.
Quintessential sports film.
Great in that film. He plays a high school. Was it a college or high? It's high school. I think high school, right?
I thought it was college because it's the Indiana Hoosiers.
Oh, yeah, you might be right. But regardless, he plays a basketball coach in the 1950s in Indiana. One of his best performances.
Okay, I'll make a note. I mean, Crimson Tide for me.
Him and Denzel, incredible.
Calling it now, Pat. You were right. Sorry, my bad. It was a high school team.
Oh, okay, all right.
Still, definitely one of the best sports films of all time.
Yeah, he is so fascinating to watch on screen because not really a good-looking guy, right? Pretty normal. It could be anybody, right? Normal-looking guy. He sounds cool, but he's like soft-spoken, but he can be really gruff and mean at the same time. He can do subtle, he can do over the top, he can do dramatic, he can do funny. He's really good at silence. Like a lot of actors have to yammer away constantly to sell their performances. He doesn't. He could have been a silent film star. That's why he's one of the all-time greats. There was really no role that he wasn't capable of excelling at.
I mean, typically, if you look at, he did French Connection, the Poseidon Adventure, and as you say, Pat, he did Superman. I mean, they're three very, very different characters. It just shows his sort of versatility, and he continued to do that for decades to come. It was amazing. Loved him.
He even did random cameo stuff. Like, do either of you recall his small bit in Young Frankenstein where he plays the blind guy?
Yes.
Oh yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Just incredible. Like you're like it's just like he's in the film for like 2 minutes. Hilarious.
Now, we know that it was a money job from his perspective, but what did we think about him in the film?
I love him in this. I love how he saves the entire group multiple times. He's just screaming at the group to continue on. Really bold decision to kill off his character. Yeah, we mentioned this before, how this film was just unafraid to kill off main characters. Well, they kill the main character off. You just don't see this often, the hero dying like this in a film. It's sort of a glorious death, you could say. He's trying to save them, but he does get it done, but then he just falls to a death. I remember it really freaked me out as a kid when he died.
Especially, I actually had a lot of thought around that, around how much it means to actually see the main character of the film die before the ending, and then how that develops the plot further. I'm not sure if either of you have seen the Korean film. It was released in 2016, Train to Busan. And, Paul, I see you shaking your head. Very similarly, you had a limited amount of time to get to know these characters on a train, and the main character who just really wants to bring his daughter to safety to get to her mom. And while this is all happening, it's a zombie apocalypse, so it's a bit of a disaster film. And, spoiler warning, the main character dies. And so do characters on the train that you really wanted to root for to survive. But at the end of the day, like, it was along that same parallel of moving forward through the disaster. So I think that was one film that I saw as like made that bold decision. I remember seeing it in 2016 or a few years after and thinking like, wow, like that's really bold. And that film did really well. At 100 million in the box office, only made it for like 8 million or something like that.
That's a good call out. That's one of the only like quote unquote zombie movies I've seen that I thought was any good. That's a really good film. And you're right, the characters that get killed off in that film, it's shocking. But Hackman's character in this, he has a lot of personality, despite the fact that you don't know much about him. Like, once Red Button's character gives him the idea that they need to just go up, he goes into savior mode. And it's pretty wonderful to watch. He's determined to save everyone. He refuses to let anything get in his way. He's smart enough to know that he can't convince everyone, and he doesn't waste time trying to convince everyone. He makes the most of what he can by trying to save those that he can. And there's surprisingly touching moments in the film. Like when he says goodbye to the other priest, it was, wow, like this is, again, to your point, Paul, you expect a lot of shallowness from a disaster film. There is a surprising amount of pretty heartfelt drama in this.
And I have to say that the bit that for me, which sort of summed up the nuances of this film, was right at the end when they know they're going to be rescued and they're all cheering and then the daylight appears and then they start thinking about all the people that didn't survive and the guilt and the sorrow and everything else that was across their faces. It was quite moving.
Borgnine, he looks crushed because his wife was just alive 5 minutes earlier.
Yeah, and yet, in other films, they'll be like, yeah, we've been saved, off they go, and that's it. There's no thought for everyone else that's previously sort of fallen. So, yeah, that was an incredibly touching moment, which I think as a kid probably just washed right over me. But as an adult, I thought it was fantastic.
I'm not going to read the whole quote from Reverend Scott's sermon, but I really like it. And it's a very memorable scene early on in the film. Back to Borgnine. I know we were talking about him earlier. When his wife dies and he loses it, it's genuinely phenomenal acting.
Right.
I remember as a kid, I remember being shocked by her death, but I remember his rant when he starts screaming at Hackman. You don't appreciate it much as a kid, but now that I am older and I'm married, you really feel it because it's easy to dismiss his performance in that scene as going over the top. And then you realize, like, if you were in his shoes and that happened to you, you would have a complete meltdown. The rest of the cast, Red Buttons, I think, is great. I haven't seen him in much. He was in a lot of like, I guess, like older films. I remember him having a pretty memorable performance in The Longest Day, despite being a massive all-star cast. He was a standout in that film, which is hard to do, and I have to give him props for that. Shelley Winters, she got an Oscar nomination for this film. Probably should have won. She gained the weight for the role, allegedly, and apparently never lost it. She lost the award to Eileen Heckart for Butterflies Are Free. I have no idea what that is. But worth pointing out, Shelley Winters was already a two-time Oscar winner by the time she was in this film. So probably the chances of winning a third were slim, but she's an amazing character actor. I had seen her in other stuff, probably most famously in The Diary of Anne Frank, which she won one of her Oscars for. She's really great in that film. She also plays in that film a semi-annoying Jewish housewife. Her chemistry with Jack Albertson here is amazing. They really feel like a real couple. Apparently they hated each other on set, but you don't see it on screen. They absolutely seem like a married couple. Her underwater scenes, it's not long where she's swimming underwater. She completely sells it. She trained with an Olympic swimmer to prepare for the role. You can tell she looks completely natural underwater, and it's a great moment in the film. Her character really did save everyone when she saves Gene Hackman.
A fun little game, if you ever watch it again, is try and hold your breath for as long as they did. I tried it.
Yeah.
I would have drowned. I'll call it. And the fact that Gene Hackman told Ernest Borgnine to go back again and fetch the others, I'd be like, no, you're right. I've just tugged the rope. It was an incredible amount of time.
Yeah, she really trained for it. And as someone, I do swim for exercise occasionally. It is a real thing. You can train for it, but it takes a lot of practice. And you're right. Like most people wouldn't make it, but never underestimate the power of adrenaline. Who knows what you're capable of in that situation? And again, that goes back to the Walter Mitty thing. Ordinary people in this situation, you never know what someone's capable of. But yeah, her chemistry with Jack Albertson, Anton, you called this out. That's the Jack Albertson. That's Grandpa Joe from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. That piece of shit. I'm just kidding. He really was a piece of shit in that film, though.
I love going back and thinking about that. Like, he was just pretty greedy, wasn't he?
Yeah, deadbeat. It's crazy. I saw this film a bunch of times as a kid. I saw Willy Wonka a bunch of times as a kid, and I never made the connection that he was in both, and I don't know how.
Well, here we are.
Another great bit of acting when Jack Albertson finds Shelley Winters' body.
Oh, just crushing.
Man, it's hard. And then Hackman telling him he has to go on because he tells him, quote, your place is with the living. That's deep. Like, that's some deep stuff.
Yeah.
It's just, again, you don't expect that in this kind of film.
The way you see them in early on in the film, in the opening of the film, they're just like sunbathing, just having their back and forth, their chit chat. And I just look at them and I just say, oh yeah, there's just, I can see that as like any married couple and that have been married for years. And I think like that's why when you get to that point where Jack Albertson's character has lost his wife and you really do feel for him, and it is just crushing.
The rest of the cast, I think, is solid. Roddy McDowall, doesn't have a lot to do, but he's always memorable, usually whenever he's in. Pamela Sue Martin, who plays the older sister of, I don't remember her character's name, but she was the original Nancy Drew, Anton.
There we go.
That was her. And then Stella Stevens, who plays the former hooker who's married to Ernest Borgnine. She's great in the role. A lot of standouts in the cast. Really, there's really not a weak link. The only thing I found weird was Pamela Sue Martin's character being into Gene Hackman. Thank goodness they didn't go into that too much because it was kind of weird, not really elaborated on, and I think we're all better off for it.
Yeah, too often films or shows get a romance shoehorned in. Thankfully, not here.
Yeah. And then I don't want to go on without mentioning Leslie Nielsen as the captain of the ship.
Oh, legend, Leslie Nielsen.
Yeah, it's easy to forget. He only did dramatic roles before Airplane. Doesn't have a lot to do, but it's just cool to see him in this kind of role. Oh, Leslie Nielsen, him, going back and forth with the kid. You can kind of see where that would surface again a few years later in Airplane.
Yeah, seeing Leslie Nielsen play it straight, I couldn't help but start to feel like, am I watching like a portion of Airplane or The Naked Gun? But just goes to show how impactful Leslie Nielsen in those films, right?
Yeah. He's essentially playing the exact same character, just deadpan.
Yeah, just complete deadpan.
But it's interesting to see him in this type of role. Number 2 reason why this wasn't better, allegedly, the production. We mentioned the budget a couple times. I'm still blown away by this. It's so impressive. This is just one of those films where they multiplied every dollar on screen 100-fold. Just to give you guys some perspective, this had a lower budget than contemporaries like Airport, Patton, The Exorcist, and The Godfather. It was cheaper than all of those films. Unbelievable.
And it's still, and on the rewatch, looked very good. I was impressed.
Holds up really well. Like, some of the model shots look a little dated. The level of effort that they put into the production design, the sets, the on-screen practical effects, that was as good as it got for 1972. And I think now going into 2024, I thought it held up really well.
I think a lot of it is also to do because it was practical. The sets, everything was built. It was physical, and fair play to the production team to invert everything, and to make sure it's all remained accurate. It was incredible, and you really felt
that is not easy to do.
no, and you really felt claustrophobic. You did feel you were in that ship, and they weren't in some sort of CGI studio or something like that. It really felt physical and real.
Oh, you nailed it. The claustrophobia that you feel in a lot of these scenes, especially now on on a big TV, this looks amazing in high def. Again, some of the model work is dated, but the cinematography really is excellent. The lighting and the blocking are top notch. The shot that stood out to me the most in the banquet hall when after the ship flips over, when the water starts pouring in to the bottom. Yeah, I think it's just after Gene Hackman's character and the others start to climb the Christmas tree, and he's trying to talk everybody else into following him, and the water starts rushing in, and the entire crowd of people start to panic, and they're all running and trying to get up the tree. Like it's a breathtaking shot. Really good stuff.
Just one comment in regard to that shot, and one of the issues I have with the film is, and I'd love to hear your feedback. Why couldn't Gene just wait until the water had risen? Why did he have to leave? Is it because he felt it was a race against time, or because those people weren't necessarily all going to drown?
They would have drowned.
Yeah.
With the way the water was coming into the bottom, it would have created like almost like a semi whirlpool effect. And at that point, you can't bank on everybody being able to stay afloat. And think about it, by the time the water gets up to that platform, at the rate the water is rising, there's no possibility of them all being able to fit through that doorway. By that point, it's just way too late.
Okay, I don't feel so bad now.
No, you're welcome. Before I forget, too, do y'all recall the stunt? This is an incredible stunt, and I think it's if you look up like greatest stunts of all time, it's usually on the list. Just after the ship flips over and the guy falls, it looks like 50, 60 feet in and lands on the glass ceiling.
Oh yeah.
I don't know how they did that, but that's pretty convincing. That looks completely real. Really terrifying. Again, this is a horror movie.
Right. But like you said, I think that was one of if the film, right, is about the disaster and then the after, and trying to navigate through this like maze of horrors. I think it was said, Pat or Paul, one of you said it best. The film just goes straight to the point. Once the disaster hits, there's no slowing down. And I felt like with that momentum as we're going through and the water's coming in, the tide is hitting the ship, it's just all panic. And the practical effects and the effects on the film still hold up to this day.
Yeah, Gene Siskel said about this film, quote, "The film's technical excellence, special effects, production design, and the stars doing their own stunts holds one's interest," end quote. I just love how it drops you right into the story. You get a tiny bit of exposition in the opening shot where it's just text, right? It's not really narration, just a brief text. They're like, this is the story of the SS Poseidon that flipped over and most of the people died. It drops you right into the story. They introduce you to the principal players. There's no fluff. There's really no filler. They do a very good job of giving everybody a little bit of a backstory and a little bit of a personality, but this is a really well-paced film. It unfolds pretty much in real time. As far as I know, like, what is the film? The film takes place over basically less than maybe 12 hours, right? Just about.
Right, very short amount of time.
None of the scenes drag on too long. It's really well paced. It comes in at under 2 hours. I have to give director Ronald Neame a lot of credit for this. He kept things going at a good clip, especially when you consider the era this came out. A lot of films during that era, regardless of the runtime, were just paced very differently than they are now. But the pacing here is spot on. I don't think there's a single moment of screen time here that's wasted.
totally agree with you. I mean, in terms of the text at the beginning, do you think, having watched it, what the reasoning was for putting that on? Because ultimately, you'll be seeing that in the film. I never. I was
I-
always trying to figure out why why they included
it,
it, as though you didn't quite know
it's
why you were there.
it might have been just a reference to the novel, just being a
Yeah.
slice of life type of story.
Mm.
Like, this is what you're about to see over the next 2 hours. Bang, here you go.
I can see the technique as a way to build the suspense. It's like, this is the story of a disaster. And then it opens with the happy couple, people jogging on the cruise.
Yeah.
And you go from there. You're like, so when is this going to go to hell?
Right.
Something I found during the research, the original script called for Reverend Scott to send Mrs. Rosen, that's Shelley Winter's character, on her underwater mission and for her to get trapped and needing rescuing by him, Gene Hackman. But Hackman decided that his character would never ask her to do this, and he suggested that their character situations be reversed. Director Ronald Neame agreed, and they persuaded Shelley Winters that this was better for her character. I think great decision on Hackman's part.
I love their chemistry throughout the film. Like when Hackman's like pushing her out of like, what was it? She was like stuck in the tree, and just sorry to be so familiar.
Yeah. He did a great job of playing a reverend too, because if anyone knows any reverends, they have to excel at handling all different types of personalities too.
Mhm.
And you see that in Gene Hackman's character. He motivates different characters in different ways via saying different things. And it just speaks to the writing of this film. And, maybe Hackman thought this was a money job, but as we can see from the behind the scenes stuff, he didn't phone this in. He gave this 100%. I love the simplicity of the ending. The rescuers cut them out, with the welding, right? They cut a hole in the ship. The 6 of them get off. They get in the helicopter and it just takes off. That's it. It's very unsentimental. You get a couple shots of the characters like Borgnine, thinking about those that they've lost. Part of this was due to budget, right? There was originally going to be a bit more, but there was an ending that they planned to do with rescue boats surrounding the sinking ship, but they didn't have the money for it, and the shot of the helicopter lifting off of the hull was done on the studio lot, looking upward to avoid seeing the surrounding buildings. But I like the simplicity of it. The film just ends.
No, agreed. But are we giving it too much credit for maybe missing out on some budget towards the end?
Maybe. I do think it's one of those situations where the lack of money helped them in a way.
Agreed. We've talked about that before. Constraints can create for greater creativity.
Yeah.
I would slightly disagree. One of my issues with that ending is it just seemed like they found those 6 people, got them on a helicopter and left, and didn't seem to be too concerned about trying to find anyone else. So it was like, oh right,
I
you
see what
guys
you
are
mean.
just you guys just leave it now. Now with Pat, you said about the budget that we're going to have boats. If you, as the helicopter sort of pulled away, and you saw the boats surrounding the ship, I'd be like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense now. But the fact that they just went, are you the only people? And they went, yeah. And it's based on absolutely nothing. They just went on the helicopter and off they went. And I was like, oh,
That's
it's a
a
bit
good point, Paul.
harsh. Really
That's a good
harsh.
point.
That is a good point. You don't really get a sense of like, well, how was the ship literally about to sink? Was it about to go under? That's true. That's a good point. You just don't know. You have to assume it didn't have much time left. I think, a real world example of this, the story of like the Andrea Doria? It was an Italian cruise ship. It was a passenger liner, essentially in the 50s. It collided with another ship off the coast of Long Island in heavy fog, and it sank in a very similar manner to the Poseidon Adventure. It eventually flipped over. It's pretty interesting is not the right word, but academically, you can watch it sink on YouTube. Like, it was filmed from helicopters. It basically capsized, flipped over upside down, and just sank. And it always reminded me of this film. I also did like how early on in the film with Leslie Nielsen's character, they explained why the ship was at risk, how they were top heavy and they weren't taking on enough ballast because the ship's owners were trying to save money. They actually, they gave a little bit, I think it was useful exposition where like you're like, well, how does the ship just flip over? Like, don't they account for this kind of thing? And like, no, they actually provide a semi plausible technical reason for it. I don't have anything else to add.
I was going. Any other points is really kind of nitpicking. I would say things where apart from Shelley Winters, there wasn't a lot of strong female characters. They were all very quite passive and being led by the men. The other issue, I would say it was a question. So they knew this wave was coming on and they just didn't seem to want to point the ship the other way. They just kept staring at the radar, seeing this wave, and yet didn't do anything about it apart from just look.
Oh, no, they tried to turn.
But that was literally once they saw it.
Yeah,
The guy went, there's something over port side. They had a look. There was this huge wave. It's like, okay, right now we need to turn. It just seemed a bit odd that they, seeing this massive wave, which they did describe as being, that looks quite a significant tidal wave coming our way, but they kept on going forward. I thought it was a bit of an odd decision. But as you say, Pat, maybe it was because they needed to get to the island, to get to Greece, and they'll just survive it anyway or ride the wave.
How fast did they say the wave was coming on? Was it like 60 knots or was it faster than that?
Couldn't tell you, to be honest.
60 knots is what stands out in my mind, but that is crazy fast. And a passenger liner, a cruise ship like that can do about like 25 knots at the most. So you figure there's no way they're going to be able to avoid it. Like maybe you try to turn into it, but who knows? Like you said, nitpicking for sure. But that's it as far as the reasons go for the Poseidon Adventure. I don't think it is fooling the listeners at this point to say that we did not hate this film. Anton, the last 1970s film we covered on this podcast was the animated Lord of the Rings, which was abysmal. There's not a lot to say about it other than just don't watch it. But as far as wrapping this up and giving our ratings, Paul, as you are the guest, would you like to go first?
Sure. I would give this a solid B. To me, it did everything on the label, provided a very good disaster movie. There was never a dull moment. The acting was fantastic. The emotional human side of things was well thought out and presented. And the fact that they did sacrifice some of their lead stars during the story, I thought was fantastic. And it's confirmed my memories of a kid of really enjoying that film.
Very nice. I'm happy to go next. I really enjoyed rewatching this film and seeing it. There was a huge enjoyment for me looking at this cast, and I know one of the key criticisms for the film is that there are very stereotype roles in the film for disaster films, but I think what really sets this film apart is just the caliber of the actors and actresses in each of these roles. And I think that for me really is what I enjoyed. I enjoyed the acting. I really enjoyed the way that the special effects has stood well to the test of time. And for me, this was a very enjoyable experience. I think that when it comes to disaster films, my main comparison for this, for the podcast, has to be Airport. And I definitely enjoyed Airport, but this even slightly more. So with that, while it may not be my favorite film of all time, I have, looking at the different elements and where we've landed based on why the film wasn't better, I have to actually say that to me, this film was a B+.
Anton, I'm glad you brought up Airport because I think you and I both rated that a B. As far as disaster films go, you can't do much better than this. I understand some of the criticism of it. Some of this is cheesy. There's no getting around it. There are definitely things in this film that are of the era of 1972. The band, some of the characters, some of the dialogue, it is a little dated. Some of the effects look of the time, but I think considering the budget and of the time they came out, this is top of the line production. This is popcorn entertainment done properly. The plot is paper thin, but who cares when you have this cast and they're all giving great performances? There is some genuinely great drama in this film. There is some genuinely great horrifying moments in this film. There is some genuinely great thrills in this film. We haven't mentioned the John Williams score. As far as is it one of the best John Williams scores? Probably not, but that's only because of the greatness of John Williams. But the fact that you just had young John Williams doing the score is just another plus in this film's favor. This is a film that they just couldn't make now. They tried to make it almost 20 years ago. It was a complete failure. And I hope they never remake this film because there's just no way that they could do it justice. I really enjoyed rewatching this. I was so satisfied about how well this held up to me. I was really nervous because I hadn't seen it in probably 20 years. It's not perfect, but it knows what it is. The cast is amazing. Hackman, Borgnine, Shelley Winters, all standouts. The melodrama is kept to a minimum. The camp is just about right. The pacing is great. There's no point of this film that drags. For what this type of film is, you cannot ask for better than this. I am going to give this the same rating as you, Anton, a B+. You could talk me into an A- because I think in terms of disaster movies, this might be the best one. I don't know that there is a better one.
Yeah, I felt the same way.
Yeah. I actually, I will go A- just because of just how well I thought this held up.
Yeah, talk yourself up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think, like, in terms of disaster movies, is there anything better than this? It's the best of its kind. I think both of you might have given this a little too low rating, personally. But
yeah, I feel bad now.
Yeah, you can bump it up. It's all right, Paul. You can talk yourself into a B+. It's just, this really is a classic. The reason why I like it more than Airport, Anton, is Airport had a little bit too much soap opera, and this had a little bit better drama and characters for me, and that's why it's an A- for me.
That's fair. Well, we'll see. I haven't done any grade adjustments, but who knows? Maybe that'll come in the near future.
There's no reason why you can't. B+ is a great film.
Yeah, I think listening to your two comments, I think in relation to disaster movies, yeah, I definitely is a B+. I was kind of thinking of it in terms of just films in general. That's my get out clause. So yeah, a B+ for me.
Fantastic. Well, that is it for the Poseidon Adventure. Paul, thank you so much for joining us again. It's always a pleasure. We always talk about some great films, except for Alien 3. I hope we never have to talk about anything like that again. Although it was fun to discuss it with you regardless.
We're going to bring that Twitch back, talking about it.
Paul, I'd like to get you here for an old school James Bond movie. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good. Live and Let Die. Planning to do that anytime soon, or?
Oh, we sure are. I love Live and Let Die.
Or for one of the worst,
film.
any of the Timothy Dalton ones, or the late Roger Moore's. That's when I feel like it dipped substantially. So I'm more than happy to talk about any of those.
They're so much fun to rewatch too. Even if the quality isn't great, I have a huge soft spot for Roger Moore.
But it did get to that point when he was getting so old that it was just
he just got too old. I agree.
Yeah, any of those classics. Tombstone, baby, Tombstone.
Oh, it's so great. Anton, I don't even know what next week's episode is. I forgot.
Next week's episode, we are going to be putting on our racing helmets, right?
No, that's before this.
Then we are going to be going back in time and fighting Nazis.
We are?
As
I'm drawing a total blank.
As a sentinel of justice.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it's another Marvel movie coming up next week. Listeners can expect Captain America: The First Avenger. Thank you, Anton, for bailing me out of that, because I just threw a complete blank on my own podcast.
We have a lot booked.
Yeah, we do. Yeah. No, and just full disclosure, we are sort of recording some of these episodes out of order, so please forgive our confusion. But Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us. We will have you back soon.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Pleasure as always. Love the pod. Keep it going.
Absolutely. We will see you next week on Why Wasn't It Better?